been making and putting videos on YouTube for a few years now, probably about 6 or 7 years. Some are pretty rubbish, some are not so bad. I've had a few hits on them. I've been trolled a few times, but I've decided to be a little bit more organised about it now, and I'm going to I'm starting this series which I'm calling Notes to the Home Woodworker, and the idea is that there'll be a series of shortish videos with some longer project ones interspersed, and the shortish ones will be about sort of various techniques of woodworking, and it's sort of aimed at the not so much the expert woodworker, but someone who's sort of early on their journey in woodworking and are looking for information. I thought we'd start by just looking at the basic tools that you need to get started in woodwork. It can be an expensive business, depends how you go about it really, whether you're time rich or money rich. If you're time rich, not got so much money, you can buy some reasonable tools on eBay and fettle them up to get them performing quite well. This is a sort of small a kit I've got here, which would be good to sort of just get you started, and I've divided them into sort of categories. So at the end here, I've got all my measuring and marking tools, gauges, marking knife, ruler and that sort of thing, and then I've got what I call the cutting tools, which basically are known as edge tools. So we've got planes and chisels, and then sawing. There's just 2 saws that you need really to get yourself started, and I've got hitting tools. I couldn't think of any other categorization for that, so we've got a mallet here and a hammer. Sharpening, well, probably in later videos we'll look at sharpening in more detail, because it's a source of great trauma to woodworkers, how they go about doing their sharpening. And then finally we've got clamping and holding. That's a quick run through. Now what we'll do is we'll look in more detail at the particular groups of tools. Let's start with measuring tools. Accuracy is really important in woodwork, and being able to use, having a good set and being able to use a set of measuring tools is quite vital really. If we just look at the actual measuring instruments, so that's rulers and tape measures. Good tape measure. I prefer not to use a tape measure if possible. What's wrong with a tape measure, I hear you ask? Well, it's partly to do with this little bit at the end here, it's a little tab that moves in and out, which accounts for whether you're measuring internal or external diameter. I never really trust them, unless, as I say, you're using an extraordinarily upmarket tape measure. This one I've got here is a Stanley Tylon, whatever that means. One way of avoiding that is to actually do your measurement from the 100mm mark and then deduct it from the final measurement at the other end. But quite often you find your parts end up 100mm too long because you forget to deduct the measurement. The other thing is how sort of floppy, and that introduces inaccuracy. So where possible, for measurements under a metre, I prefer to use something like this metre rule than the tape measure. Obviously, longer measurements, when you work on a large pieces of furniture, you have to use something like this. But if possible, I like to avoid it. So I would recommend that you have at least a 12-inch steel rule, 300mm steel rule, and preferably one longer as well. This is a metre long rule, basically because they're more accurate. The other thing with steel rules is that you're not actually just using them for measuring, you're also using them for checking stuff is flat, which is quite an important function. And you will find with most modern steel rules, they're made out of mild steel. I don't know whether you can see that, but this one's, it's bent along that way. It might be straight that way, but it's bent in that direction, and they just get flexed and they don't spring back. There's older rulers. This is an old, I've had this 40 years or so. I might even inherited it from my father. And that, so it must be about 40 or 50 years old. And can you see it's still dead straight because it's made with spring steel. The only problem with spring steel is it goes rusty, so you can see this one's completely useless for actually measuring stuff, but it's very useful for checking whether surfaces are flat or not. So if you're ever at a car boot sale and you see a dirty old black ruler like this, just check it out and see whether it's flat or not, and you probably ought to pick one up for 10 pence or so. But they're really useful. So yeah, and the other thing is you need to really sort of check your rulers together. So this, I would put this 30mm ruler against the longer one, and just to check that the calibrations do line up. Because if they don't, then you're going to have discrepancies between whether you're using the 30mm ruler or the meter ruler. So next is marking gauges. These are used for marking lines parallel to a known surface or a known edge. I tend to prefer this sort, which is a shaft with a pin in it and a sliding stock which goes up and down, and you set the distance between the pin and the stock. There is another sort of more contemporary style, which is this, which is usually all metal. Consists of like a wheel at this end, a sharp wheel, and you set the distance between the wheel and the adjustables. What do you call that? I don't know. Call it a stock, I suppose. So you've got an adjustable stock there, and you can do micro adjustments on it like that. It might just be that I'm a bit of a stick in the mud. I just don't get on with it. But I also find that the mark that's left is quite difficult to see sometimes. And also this one, which I have from Axminster, is not particularly brilliant, not terribly accurate. It's a bit flimsy. I understand the ones from Veritas are a better deal. So if you're into sort of something a little bit more innovative, then you might think about getting one of these. The other thing is when you're doing mortise and tenons, it's quite useful to have a Mortise Gage. Now usually they're a conventional gauge on one side, so you've got the stock and the pin there. But then on the other side you've got two pins which are adjustable. So, well, one of them is adjustable. The inner one you can move in and out. Now I would recommend that you get one with a thumb screw here. You do get some where without the thumb screw, where the pin is moved just by moving a little peg here. And the problem with them is you've then got to, once you've adjusted the distance between the pins, you've then got to adjust this distance, and you've got to hold that peg to avoid the pins becoming unadjusted. Whereas with you've got the thumb screw here, you've got greater accuracy. There's less likely to be inadvertent adjustment. Obviously the thumb screw one's a little bit more expensive, but I think if you can get them like that, then it's worth getting. There can be problems with especially with the Mortise gauges, in as much as the pins often aren't the same length. Even new ones, straight from the manufacturer, they're not brilliant at getting those pins right, and you might have to do a little bit of fettling on that. And we may look at that at a future video. Squaring. I would recommend an engineer's square rather than the wooden, the type of square with a wooden stock, which used to be the common one used. That's what we all used in woodwork classes in schools, when they had woodwork classes in schools. So this is an engineer's square. A couple of things you need to check. Is it square? That's a good start. So to check for square, if you work from a known edge, so I'm just going to use the edge of the bench here just for demonstration purposes. If I draw a line like that and then come at it from the other side, and those two lines should line up. That's not bad. And that's a sort of a fairly, we could do a more accurate test if we sent it off somewhere to get calibrated, but I think for general purposes that's a good enough test. Sometimes you do find with use, so if you say you were looking for one at a car boot sale or something, with use they tend to get a little bit worn there. You know, if you're using a marking knife, which we'll talk about later, using a marking knife against there, then it tends to get worn. So that's something to look out for. You can sort of redress that edge with a file. This one's, I think this is a 4-inch, is it? Yeah, it's about a bit over 5 inches, perhaps. That's a sort of a reasonable size. Possibly if you get further into woodwork, you might want to get a larger one for sort of doing over a whole set of joints or something, but that's a good starter. I did mention before about a marking knife, you know, wearing the edge of the square. For accuracy, you should always work to a knife line rather than to a pencil line. So it's good to use a marking knife when you're squaring up and things like that. And that's also why we use a marking gauge, because you get an impressed line with a marking gauge rather than just a pencil line, which is a bit wishy-washy. A marking knife consists of a blade which is flat on one side and beveled on the other. The idea is that you always use it with a flat against the square, so you get an accuracy. If you do it the other way around, then the bevel of the knife will move the point away from the square. And that's another reason why it's not a good idea to use a Stanley knife for marking, because the bevel of the knife may give you an inaccuracy, and what we're looking for is accuracy all the time. So it's worth using a marking knife. And I think about that. Oh yes, about the measuring and marking tools, the pencil. Now, I'll disparage a pencil saying you should use a marking knife, but there are times when you do need to use a pencil, and I would recommend that you use an H pencil rather than an HB. HBs tend to go blunt very quickly, and we need to keep the pencil. This one actually a bit blunt at the moment. You need to keep the pencil really nice and sharp, so either have a decent pencil sharpener in your workshop, or you can use a chisel to sharpen it, but you do need to have a nice sharp edge at all times, again to ensure accuracy, and you're more likely to keep that with an H rather than an HB pencil. The next tools we'll look at are cutting tools, or edge tools as they're known. So basically that consists of a set of chisels and your planes. When you talk about chisels, generally nowadays we're thinking bevel edge chisels, which are fairly ubiquitous in the workshop nowadays. As you get more into woodwork, you may decide you want to sort of specialise in hand tools. You might want to get a set of mortise chisels, but just for starting up, a set of 5 bevel edge chisels can do most of what you want to do. And when I say a set of 5, we're going from 6mm or 1/4 inch up to 26mm, 1 inch. And we'll sort of look at that in a bit more detail in a minute. The other tools are planes. So these are the planes I tend to go to mostly. There's a record 5.5 jack plane there, and also this little block plane. They should do most of what you want to do, you know, when you're first starting up. Possibly not even bother with the jack plane, the block plane. You could do most with the jack plane. If we look a little bit more at the chisels, as I say, this is my set of 5. These are Narix cabinet makers chisels. They're probably about 65 quid for a set of 5. Now, with chisels, it's very much a matter of you pay some money and you take a choice. And a lot of it's to do with the profile of the chisel. Now, this is a Stanley Fat Max Chisel, and they come out at about 47 quid for a set of 5. Or you could really break the bank and go for a set of blue spruce, which are considered to be the bee's knees, and they're about 450 quid for a set of 5. And then we've got sort of various other tools in a sliding scale from top to bottom. And the main difference well, apart from the hardness of the steel, but one of the important differences is the profile of the chisel. You probably can't get that, but this is still quite thick at the bottom. The bevel doesn't go right down to the edge, so you've got quite a wide edge to it, whereas something like the Narex cabinet makers, I don't know if you put those two together, you can see that the edge is a lot smaller on the cabinet maker's chisel. If I was to look at perhaps an Ashley Isles chisel, which is a British sort of upmarket chisel, you could probably get a set of 5 of these for about 150 quid. You can see that the actual edge is a lot smaller, narrow on that, and it just means that you can do more delicate work. You can get into sort of nice tight corners when you're dovetailing and that sort of thing. Now you may want to look at second-hand chisels. One thing you do need to be careful about with that is that when we'll be looking at this later, or I do actually have a video on YouTube about flattening the back of a chisel, but when you're buying a chisel, you do need to make sure that the back is either very slightly concave or dead flat. Especially on the second-hand chisels, you need to put a straight edge up like that. So I'm using the inside of this square, which is quite a good tool to use for checking. And you need to make sure that it is actually dead flat all along there, because otherwise you've got a lot of work to, when I say dead flat, that it isn't convex, so it's not curving away like that. Because if it is, then you've got a lot of work to flatten it. It may even not be flattenable. Let's have a little look at planes. Again, you pays your money and you takes your choice. You can either buy a new plane, or you can go on eBay or look at car boot sales for planes. Most of my planes actually come from eBay, that I've bought them and fettled them up. And I will do a video fairly soon on buying planes on eBay and what to look for and how to go about fettling them. So this one came off eBay fairly recently, actually, because I mislaid my previous one, which I'd had for a while, and this is cutting quite well now. I've sort of done some work on tidying it up, so I'll say there'll be a video about that later. Most planes are the sort of standard Bailey pattern, which you see in perhaps on the continent. There might be some sort of different pattern planes, but generally Anglo-Saxon, Americans and in England, it's this sort of standard Bailey pattern plane. If you want to buy a plane, I'd suggest don't go and buy a new Irwin or Stanley, because they're bloody difficult to get to work. You have to do a lot of work to get them to sort of function and cut well. You've got a bit of a choice, as I say, pays your money, takes your choice. You could go out and buy a Lie-Nielsen, which is an American plane. Sort of they specialise in making copies of Stanley planes, and they're very good planes, but they're about 350 quid each. This one here is a Clifton. It's a British made. Again, that's around about that sort of price, and they're just sort of, they're more chunkily made than the old record and Stanley planes that you can get on eBay. The blades thicker, and it's got what's called a bedrock seating of the unit into the plane, which all makes it more expensive to manufacture. There is a Chinese version of an expensive plane, if that's not a contradiction in terms, this is a Quansheng, which has the same sort of features as the Lie-Nielsen and the Clifton, but at a cheaper sort of manufacturing standard. I don't think the standard is affecting the quality hugely. A lot of it's to do with the sort of surface finish and that sort of thing, but the actual cut you can get from these is very good. So you could probably get a 5.5 for about £150 of the Quansheng. Block planes, I quite like these little apron planes. I don't know if you can see that. It just sits very nicely into the hand. Again, this is a Quansheng one, a Chinese one. I've got a Lie-Nielsen one, but I don't find it's as good at all as this one, because the Lie-Nielsen's got a very small adjuster at the back here, which I find quite difficult to use. And these cut very nicely. and they're good for doing little detail cuts and just sort of chamfering or arrasing the edges of things. And I think that's about it on the cutting tools. Sawing. You really probably only need to start with just two tools. One would be a handsaw, and the other one would be a back saw. By back saw we mean a saw with this either brass or steel back to it, which keeps it rigid because it's quite thin. You need something to sort of stop it flexing and bending. And I think some people, purists, would probably troll me for this, but I would suggest to start with just an ordinary hard point saw, the sort of thing you can buy from the builders merchants. And these are just used for sawing, rough sawing for possibly getting panels down to size. As I say, just for rough sawing to get things down to a manageable size, and then for planing up and more detailed cutting. And the more detailed cutting would be done with a back saw. I mean, this is what I would call a Tenon Saw. Some might call it a sash saw. The nomenclature is getting quite complicated with saws. About 15 teeth to the inch. Now the problem is, it will need sharpening eventually, and how do you go about doing that? Sharpening is can be quite tricky. You can again get hard point versions of these, but I think for something like this, I think it's worth either finding someone who can sharpen it for you or learning how to sharpen it. And I will post a link on this video to a very good sort of treatise on sharpening that's on the internet, which I've used as a reference for some of my sharpening. This one actually, I can't remember where this one came from. I think I got it second hand from somewhere. It's been sharpened quite a few times, but I don't know if you can see that it's actually sort of narrower at the front than it is at the back. Some saws some market saws are actually intentionally sharpened in that way, but I don't think that was the case. I think this has just come about from repeated sharpening. The other one you might want to consider, which overcomes the problem of sharpening, would be a Japanese saw. So this is a Japanese saw which I use occasionally. I've not really taken to them usually. I much prefer sort of a Western style saw. And these have replaceable blades. They're very, very flexible. You can see that. I can sort of flip that. So they cut on the back stroke. That's partly why they can be flexible. If you were cutting on the forward stroke, then they would sort of bend and break under the pressure. But they are replaceable. So you've got this sort of spine down the back, which you can clip the blade out of and put a new one in. And I think with new blades, probably about £20–25, but they do last quite a while. This one's actually a razor saw. I think I got this from Thanet Tools many years ago. I don't know if they still exist actually. But again, that would, if you take to Japanese saws, that would be a good way of getting into sawing. So you've got sort of some options there, but certainly you would need something, a good size saw just for the rough sawing, and then you need some sort of detail saw, either a Tenon Saw or a Japanese saw. I didn't quite know how to categorise these tools, so I was calling them hitting tools. And this is the mallet I tend to use. It's just I'm used to it really. It's a wood carver's mallet, but I use it for virtually everything. I made it when I was doing a little bit of wood carving many years ago, and I've just got used to it. This is the sort of standard one that you're probably familiar with. Possibly if you did woodwork at school, it will be what you used. We use that for knocking chisels and banging things together really. But possibly a better tool for sort of assembly when you're knocking stuff together or knocking things apart is one of these. It's got a soft nose on that side and a hard sort of plastic one on that side, and it's good for as I say, knocking stuff together and apart, because it doesn't damage the wood when you hit it. You know, if you're hitting it with that, then you can end up with sort of bruising the wood and things. Whereas this soft nose here means you don't tend to bruise it so much. If you're using one of these, then you'd have to have a piece of scrap or something to sort of protect the wood from you damaging it. I mean, you can get away with one of those, but I find these quite useful. But if you're just starting off, then probably not to be used, and would use this one instead. And then you've got the hammer. Definitely not for hitting bits of wood with, because it would cause serious damage. And it doesn't actually get used that much in the workshop, because we don't use nails very much in sort of finer woodworking. We're relying on sort of the glued joints and things like that. So, as I say, it doesn't actually get used a huge amount, this hammer. Now, if you're doing a more DIY type stuff, you might want to use a claw hammer, because then you can sort of use it for pulling out nails and things like that. But generally, this is the hammer that we use in the workshop, just for sort of, I'm not sure what we use it for. We don't do much nailing. Perhaps panel pins sometimes we occasionally do it. Yeah. So the last on my list was sharpening equipment. Now I'm going to go into more detail about this on a subsequent video, because sharpening is a whole can of worms when it comes to woodwork, and I want to sort of explain it in a little bit more detail. So this is fairly brief. This what I tend to use is Waterstones. So these are the Waterstones I use here. 1000 grit, 4000 grit on the other side, and then 8000 grit. But for the beginner, I'd suggest what's called Scary Sharp. Rather funny name, but it basically consists of an abrasive film that's stuck to glass. In this case, 10mm float glass. So that gives you a flat surface in which to work on. And the abrasive film that I'm using is running from 60 microns through to about 3 microns. And that's a quick way a cheap way of getting through into sharpening. These sheets, they come in sort of standard sort of sandpaper size sheets. You can get about 3 or 4 of these out of the sheet, and they're about £3.50 for one of the bigger sheets. So you could get started with what's 5 times £3.50 for that, plus the cost of the glass, probably about 10-15 quid from the glaziers. You may also want to use a honing guide to start with, because getting the angles right can be a bit tricky. Again, that's something we'll have a look at. I have got some other videos on my channel about sharpening, but I will probably be doing another one because they're getting on a bit now, those videos. I might sort of update them a bit, and I'll be doing another one in this series of Notes for the Home Woodworker. Clamping and holding now. There is a difference between clamping and holding. Clamping is when you're trying to pull stuff together for the final glue up, really. Whereas holding is just to hold something down on the bench, or if you're offering pieces together to see whether they fit and things like that. So for holding, you don't need quite such, the forces involved aren't so great. So you can use more delicate tools. But for clamping, you need something fairly robust. Let's look at holding to start with. I find these quite useful, these little plastic pegs. They're just okay for sort of getting stuff together. When you're trying to line up boards, when you're planing them together or something like that, that's quite useful. You could use it if you had a little chip that came out or something when you were planing or something, you wanted to sort of glue it back in again. You could possibly use that for that, because you don't need a lot of force for that. Quick cramps. These are quite useful, but people do have students on my courses. They tend to try to use this because it's easy to use for actual clamping up. You know, when you're gluing up, and really it's okay, but it really doesn't give you enough pressure really. So as I say, they're useful for sort of holding stuff together, but not for your final clamping. And then if you want to exert a bit more force, then we've got G clamps. Now you can pick these up quite often in car boot sales. You do need to sort of make sure that they're not quite often they appear on car boot sales because they're knackered, because the shaft is skewed or something like that. So this is ages old. I inherited this one from my father, so it must be 70 or so years old. I think it's a record. Yeah, must be good. This is a 6-inch. But I've sort of gone away from G clamps recently because I find that F clamps work better. It gives you more sort of flexibility, and also you can quite often work them one-handed, which is an advantage. Not sure they're more expensive than a G clamp. You do need to sort of try and avoid the really cheap ones because they don't tend to hold. We had some Axminster ones in the workshop a few years ago, and we'd do a glue up, and then we'd come in the morning, they'd sort of relaxed and fallen off. They just didn't maintain their hold. So it is a matter of pays your money and takes your choice really. And then for sort of major glue ups with frames and carcasses and things like that, we'd use possibly a Sas Clamp like this. This is a record one. So you've got a steel bar with a sliding head there, which you can fix with a peg or a pin. I don't want to bother doing that. And then you've got a threaded one at this end. And the advantage of these is that if you've got a big, might be a 4-foot one, but if you've got a 6-foot piece to clamp, you can actually join the two together. So you can actually unscrew the nut at the end here, which is sort of stopping the head flying off, and you can actually join two together if you're using clamps of the same model. Sometimes the holes won't be lined up if you're not using similar clamps. That is an advantage over some of these sort of aluminium clamps that you see around, sort of like Drapers and things like that. Another good option if you're just starting up and not wanting to spend too much are these sort of metal clamp heads. So these things, and you can attach them. This is a bit of oak here. I've attached it to, and I've drilled a series of holes into for the heads to sit into. To be pinned to. These ones are good because I'm not sure all of them have this. These are either record or Paramo, I think. They're ones I've had for a long time. But they occasionally come up on eBay. But I don't know if you can see that, but the hole that the pin goes into is very slightly angled. And if you use that hole there as a guide for drilling the holes into the yoke beam or whatever wood you're going to be using, I wouldn't suggest using a soft wood because it tends to crack up and things. But if you use that hole there as a guide for drilling, then when you put your pin in there, the piece slides back, and the angle of the slot means it pulls the piece down onto the board, so you get a very positive location. Same at this end. And as I say, these occasionally come up on eBay. Not sure whether they're still sold new nowadays, but and obviously you can attach them to whatever size bit of wood appropriate to the thing you're using. Rather like I was saying, you can join these together. Equally, these are flexible because you can just get a longer piece of wood if you've got a big thing to clamp up. I've realised while I've been going through the list that there are a couple of things I have left off, one or two things I have left off the list. One is sort of just general things that you've probably got lying around anyway, which is screwdrivers and that sort of thing. But there are a couple of, three things that are fairly important, or very important, one of them. And that's sort of things that you workshop made things really, rather than things that you go out and purchase. One is a bench hook, which is very useful for sawing. So you hang it off the end of the bench and you saw like that. That's very simple to make, it's just 3 bits of wood screwed together. The other is a shooting board, which is what this is, and it's good for truing up the ends of wood. You know, once you've sawn it, the chances are it might not be square, and there's also have saw marks in it. If you want to get it nicely cleaned up, then use a plane on its side like that on the shooting board. And I will be showing you how to make that in another video as well. And the third thing is possibly the most important tool, which is your workbench, which is what all this is happening on. And I have got a video in editing at the moment of making just this bench, because it's really important that you have a good firm surface to work on. Now, when you first start, you might just get a door and fix it to the wall of your workshop, but you will come to a point where you want to have something a little bit more robust, with good holding facilities and that sort of thing. That's when you can start thinking about making a bench. As I say, I've got a video coming up on that. So that's a brief run through the basic hand tools. I haven't talked about power tools or anything like that. That will again come later on. And as I said, also I'll be going into things in more detail in subsequent videos. The next actual video, which I'm just about to start work on, is on buying and fettling up planes on eBay. We did talk about how much new planes cost. A decent new plane can be quite expensive, but getting a good plane on eBay and working on it, you can get just as good results with that as one of these more pricey ones. Now I come to towards the end. This is where you're supposed to say subscribe to my channel. If you feel like it, then it would be great if you could subscribe to the channel. And if you have been, thanks for watching.